All right, let's dive into a really fascinating and honestly a pretty intense stage of the spiritual journey. We're going to be exploring what Father Benedict Groeschel calls the Illuminative way, drawing from his book Spiritual Passages. But we're going to look at it through a very specific lens, the psychological impact. What actually happens to our minds, to our sense of self, when this new kind of spiritual light starts to break through?
And we're going to kick things off with a paradox that I think just gets right to the heart of this whole experience. Archbishop Fenelon wrote, "As light increases, we see ourselves to be worse than we thought." Now, just think about that for a second. How can that be? How can more light possibly make you feel darker? That's the central question we're going to unpack today.
So, before we get too deep into that paradox, let's just start by trying to understand what this new kind of light, this illumination, what it actually feels like on a personal level.
So technically, the Illuminative way is the middle phase of the spiritual journey. But psychologically, and this is what's so interesting, it's this period where a new experience of enlightenment starts to happen. You know, that chronic anxiety begins to drop away and this sense of real personal freedom starts to grow. It's a massive transition.
But what does that feel like? Father Groeschel gives us this incredible metaphor. He says to think of it like a spring morning right after a really bad storm. You know that feeling? Everything's been washed clean, the sky is this mix of bright sun and clouds, but there are also fallen trees, maybe even some live wires down on the road. It's beautiful, for sure, but it's also messy, and it's not without its dangers.
And that image of a beautiful but messy landscape, it leads us perfectly into the single most significant part of this stage, the huge psychological shift that happens inside. It's a turn inward.
Thomas Merton, I think, just captured this shift perfectly. He said it's not just about seeing God out there anymore. It becomes, and I quote, a more intimate and more wonderful perception of Him as directly and personally present in our own being. See? The whole focus flips from out there to in here.
And you can really see the contrast here. In the previous phase, the purgative way, the whole struggle feels external, right? God is out there, and you feel like you're fighting your way towards something. But now, in the illuminative way, that awareness completely changes. God is experienced as being within, like an intimate felt presence. This isn't just a small tweak, it's a fundamental change in how you perceive reality.
And the psychological result of this internal shift is, well, it's huge. As this inner awareness of presence grows, the need for all those protective ego defenses we build up starts to just fall away. We're talking about things like denial, rationalization, all the little tricks our minds play. They become less and less necessary when you're not constantly trying to defend this fragile, external sense of who you are.
Okay, so this internal shift, it isn't just some abstract idea. Let's look at how it actually concretely changes a person in three really key areas: their prayer, their virtue, and their very perception of the world around them.
I mean, just look at how prayer evolves. Before, it might have been what you could call an inner soliloquy. Basically just us talking to ourselves, measuring ourselves against some standard. It's a busy, active thing. But now it transforms. It becomes a gentle dialogue. It's less about getting the words right and more about the substance of the connection itself. The busy hymn becomes a soft melody. And this leads to this concept of infused virtues. From a psychological point of view, you can think of these as God-given strengths that let a person go way beyond their normal, predictable psychological limits. The classic example, of course, is the ability to genuinely love an enemy, something that, let's be honest, natural psychology might even see as a little bit off.
Now here's the crucial point. This understanding doesn't create pride. It actually creates a profound sense of humility. Groeschel notes that the saints often got along really well with sinners. Why? Because they understood deep down that without this infused, gifted strength, they themselves would be in the exact same boat, or, maybe even worse. They knew their strength wasn't their own creation.
But remember that spring morning after the storm? It's not all clear skies. There are those live wires on the road. So now we have to turn to the unexpected and frankly pretty sneaky dangers that come along with all this new light.
So is this journey just a cloudless summer day, a nice stroll in the park? As Groeschel makes crystal clear, the answer is a resounding no.
And this is where we circle right back to that quote from the beginning. Fenelon describes this moment with this just visceral image. He says, "We see issuing forth from the depths of our hearts a whole swarm of shameful feelings, like filthy reptiles crawling from a hidden cave. As our psychological defenses drop, we're suddenly forced to confront parts of ourselves we never even knew were there." And yeah, it can be pretty shocking.
And this new self-awareness, it brings all these new dangers with it.
Things like spiritual pride, thinking you've arrived, or spiritual greed, where the journey just becomes another thing to acquire. You can even get a messianic complex, this dangerous illusion that you have some unique, special calling that puts you above everybody else. These are just old ego traps dressed up in spiritual clothing.
St. Ignatius identified this one really subtle trap he called the evil spirit, which Groeschel frames as spiritual paranoia. And here's how it works. You have a seemingly good project, something for a noble cause, but it slowly becomes a disguised expression of self-love. It gets co-opted by the ego. And it always leads to bitterness and a loss of all the progress you've made. And this chart really lays out the warning signs. According to St. Ignatius, if a project starts leading to bitterness, or you start getting lazy about it, laxity, or it just drifts into mediocrity, that's a massive red flag. It's a signal to stop and honestly ask where the bad spirit, your own disguised ego, might have hijacked the mission.
So, if even our good projects can be co-opted by our own ego, and we can't really trust external outcomes, then what's the ultimate lesson of this whole stage? Well, it comes down to one really crucial distinction: fidelity over success.
Father Groeschel shares this powerful personal story. He saw a real need for a boys' home, and with a ton of help, he built one. But then, total disaster. A boy he was trying to help completely vandalized the place, just wrecked everything. And in that moment of what looked like total failure, as he sat in the ruins, he found this incredible clarity. His own pride, his ego, which had gotten all tangled up in the project's success, it was just burned away.
And this is the key insight right here. Disasters can happen to projects of the good spirit just as easily as they can to projects of the bad. External outcomes are simply not the metric we think they are.
And this all leads to the core takeaway of this entire experience, and it's summed up perfectly by Mother Teresa of Calcutta. God calls us to fidelity and not to success. The call is to be faithful to the work, to the process, to the call itself, regardless of whether it ends in what the world calls a win or a loss.
And that leaves us with a final, and I think pretty challenging question. In a world that is completely obsessed with results, with metrics, with success, what would it actually mean in our own lives to consciously choose fidelity instead?